Welcome to Restore the Glory podcast. My name is Jake Khym.
And I'm Bob Schuchts.
We're two Catholic therapists sharing what we've learned personally and professionally to help you on the journey of restoration. If you've been blessed by our podcast, please prayerfully consider partnering with us on Patreon. Your support will help cover the cost to produce the podcast, but will also give you access to exclusive content like monthly reflections and special live stream teachings. Go to patreon.com/restoretheglory and join the mission of experiencing the restoration of our God-given glory. Hey, Bob. Good to be back with you again. We have an interesting episode that we're going to do today. One of the things that happens through the course of the podcast, Bob, as you well know, is we get a lot of questions. And so we have had numerous people send us questions. So we picked some from the inbox. And you know what I feel like, Bob, is we're doing, this will be really funny. Do you know who Jimmy Fallon is?
I know who Jimmy Fallon is. I don't think I've ever watched him. But
Dang it, you took away my joke. I was going to say he's on your PVR every night, like you and Jimmy hanging out at night. Anyway, he does this thing every Friday that's called Thank You Notes, and it's goofy and silly, and it's pretty funny. But to me, this is maybe a thing we'll do periodically where it's like a Bob and Jake's Q&A or question answer. So we get lots of questions, and we thought, hey, why don't we just do a one-off episode now and again where we just try to answer people's questions that come out. So that's what we're going to do today. But before we go into that, you and I have been really busy lately. What's interesting is that I see you in meetings about ministry, but I rarely get to see you about, just normal life. So I'm looking forward to seeing you next week, I think, and hanging out. But
yeah, we get to play a little cornhole again.
I know we do.
Yeah. You got me last time.
I'm looking forward. I've been training. Yeah. I practice Monday, Wednesday, Friday every day.
Yeah. I don't know if we announced it to our listeners, but your family made the new boards. And ever since then, the tables have turned a little bit,
I can neither confirm nor deny. There's a magnetic system. Yeah. Bob, I thought it'd be worthwhile just to check in for our listeners. We usually get right to the point, and some of our listeners are like, thanks be to God, stop rambling. But some of our listeners have also said they just like hearing what's going on generically in our life. So if you don't want to hear this, hit fast forward. If you do, hang on. So Bob, what's going on in life? Like, how's the ministry going? Anything coming up you're excited about?
Yeah, all kind of stuff. But we just did, talking about question and answers, we just had a virtual conference, and Sister and I were doing question and answers last week and this week. In fact, we have one today and
really
that we're recording and on Thursday. So I always enjoy these question and answers, and it just kind of keeps you on your toes. It's like I would not be good at improv humor, but it's a kind of improv thinking on your feet.
Yes.
Because you never know what's coming.
Yes.
So, yeah, we have a therapist conference that'll probably come out before this episode. But I think what'll come out after this episode that I want to just let everybody know about is we haven't done a Restoring the Glory as opposed to Restore the Glory. A Restoring the Glory course since 2019 for the whole general public.
Yeah.
And it's always been a really powerful conference. It's the integration of theology of the body and healing.
Yes.
Which we did those first series on. And it's really powerful. And we're going to have a larger group now in Tallahassee. We're going to be able to hold 100 people, I think, which we used to only be able to hold 50. And we'll have seminarians and priests as a part of the seminary and priest program that you'll be a part of in the summer.
Yep.
They'll be a part of that. So just if people are interested, check on our website. It's going to be going up. It'll be up by the time this recording comes up for sure.
Yep.
It may be sold out by then, but
yeah, it's good for people to know. So it's Restoring the Glory, where
Restoring the Glory.
The podcast is Restore the Glory, and if people don't know, that we knew we were making the names the same back in the day.
Yeah, the course started as a course that you and I met on the Theology of the Body Institute.
That's right.
Right? That was called Sexual Healing and Redemption back then.
Yes.
So it's that course.
Yes.
A little modified, but
a little bit different. Okay, so people can check that out. That's a cool, I think, ongoing formation follow-up thing. If people are digging what they're getting here at the podcast, it's a great way to move forward. One thing I wanted to mention is that I've been developing, and it's in the beta stages now. I've done the second pilot, and it's going to be releasing to the public pretty soon, which is an identity course. I don't have a fancy name for it right now, but it's a course about the healing and restoration and even discovery of identity, who God made me to be. It's basically a deep dive into the life of Jesus, which in turn reveals us to ourselves. So I'm almost done with the second beta, and it's getting really cool feedback. So that's something you want to know about. So it's again, you and I do stuff that are outside the podcast, but it complements the podcast. And I think it's cool because we do varying things and whatnot. So yours, they can go to John Paul II Healing Center. And for mine, they can go to Life Restoration Ministries and sign up for the newsletters. Is that your guys' best way to do it too? Just sign up for the newsletter, and then how people can stay in touch or whatever?
Reports of what's coming up.
Yeah. That's what I mean. Like I want to know what's coming. So both websites have that. Anyway, people can check that out. Cool to let people know we got some other things happening.
Yeah. So is that virtual, what you're doing?
Yeah, it's all virtual.
Yeah.
And that's part of the fun is we're wondering if it could be a retreat. I would love it to have it be like the priest events that we do, where it could be a week.
Yeah.
That's sometimes a lot to ask people, but sometimes you can go so deep in that time, you know?
Our week-longs, people, since we haven't been able to have them since COVID, for the general public, they love the week-longs because you can really go deep and the healing is really profound. And so
it's my favorite style too.
Yeah, I think people will respond to it.
Yeah, we'll see how all that goes. But at some point, I'll probably ask you to do a content review just to have the wisdom of Bob get poured over it. So we'll do that offline. But anyway, so question and answer.
All right.
We ready?
Now ready.
Okay. What is your favorite color?
Blue.
Mine too. You are wearing, nobody can see it, but you're wearing blue. What is your favorite birthday? May 3rd, because it's
May 3rd.
Everyone, if you don't know, Bob and I have the same birthday.
Yeah, we were just a few years apart.
Just a few years. Not the same mother, but the same spiritual mother.
Yeah, whose celebration is May month, so we're born in her month. Right?
We're mama's boys. Yep. Yeah. We had a question here. So, Bob, I'll kick us off with something that was interesting. So all these will be anonymous. So people, listeners, if you want to write something in, you can do that on our website, restoretheglorypodcast.com, and then we'll cue them. We'll pull together the questions, and randomly we'll have an episode where we try to answer some. So this was a question that was referencing, we'll kick us off easy, referencing movies. So I think this is more directed toward me. I like to draw analogies from movies. The person said they enjoy watching movies, but they struggle with the reality that sometimes these are inappropriate. They can have sexually explicit scenes, but at the same time, they have all these lessons that you can draw from them. So how do you deal with this reality of staying chaste and not exposing ourselves to impure thoughts with reading or movies, but at the same time, get the point or the value of what's going on in the movie? So do you mind if I start this one?
I think it was directed to you, but I got a lot of thoughts.
You got a lot of thoughts? Okay, I'll start simply. This is how I look at it. Movies are an art form. They're a form of art. It's an evolution of what used to be on a stage or a play. This is going to sound, maybe people are going to crucify me for this, but Steven Spielberg is an evolution of Shakespeare. And what I mean by that is they're both artists. Shakespeare is off the charts. Steven Spielberg, pretty darn good in his own right, but they're doing the same kind of thing. They're trying to communicate messages and ideas and concepts through art form, which is movies. Now, those art forms can go sideways or recommend or promote things that aren't good or true. And so I would say not even sexually explicit things. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that can be in movies that are maybe just ideas that need to be carefully considered and whatever you're taking in. So more specifically, though, to the sexually explicit scenes, our listeners would know that if they've been around the podcast a while, that's a struggle that I've had in the past. And movies were a thing that were a significant trigger. So here's my basic, simple pastoral advice would be: know your triggers and know here's a therapeutic word, know what your window of tolerance is. Another way to say that is know where the line of occasion of sin, and then the next line is sin itself. So you don't want to get to sin itself, but how you do that is managing the line of the occasion of sin. So how do I watch a TV show or a movie that's really powerful and meaningful, and it has maybe a dynamic in it that's inappropriate? Here's my way of doing it. I have the remote control very close to me. And if as soon as something comes up, you can usually tell, oh, this is starting to go sideways. So I fast forward. Another thing that I do is I rarely watch movies that could be a negative trigger without someone else there, almost always Heather. I rarely watch these things alone. And if I do, I watch them in a place where there's no like hiding, like I'm not in a room by myself where I can, sit there. It's not as big of a temptation for me as it was before. And I think because the Lord has healed a lot, but I'm not beyond temptation. So I'm careful with those things. So that's a first stab at it. Bob, what comes up for you?
Yeah, that's good. My thoughts are similar to that, and then some tangents on it.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've become aware of, and particularly as I was kind of researching and preparing for my book, Be Restored, which is about sexual healing, is how much of our culture is pornographic. Mm-hmm. It's not just the formal pornography of the internet or what used to be magazines or pornographic movies. It's romance novels and sitcoms and billboards and conversations and dress. And it's like we're bombarded with sexual imagery. That's what the word pornography means, which is immoral images.
I didn't know that.
That's kind of the technical word for it.
Yeah.
And our minds and our hearts we talk about this, are portals. Like what do we let in? Our eyes are portals. Our thoughts are portals. And so sin isn't just whether we act out in some way sexually, but it's also what we entertain inwardly. And so, I think for a long time we've looked at what these would be really soft porn things as being somewhat innocent and not affecting us, like horror movies. I can't tell you how many people that with horror movies, with terrorizing movies, how many people have allowed demonic presence through those movies. The same thing with, sexual scenes in movies. Now, that being said, I want to speak to the other side of that, which is in Be Healed, I talk about Margie and I going on a date and watching Good Will Hunting. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know it was R-rated. I probably wouldn't have gone if I had known that, just because I don't want to put myself in that position. And then the early sex scene, and it wasn't horrible, but that early sex scene and the cussing, and I'm sitting there judging the movie and judging Margie for bringing me to the movie. And it turned out to be one of the most powerful movies to get to my heart. And so I now don't make a categorical, I will not ever watch a movie that's R-rated or has sexual scenes in it or anything like that. I think what you said is wise, is just not to just kind of let it go by and not to engage in the imagery or the thoughts afterwards, the fantasy of that afterwards. But, as John Eldredge talks a lot about, a good movie has the message of the gospel.
Yes.
And so even though the scripture deals with a lot of unholy images, like Amnon raping Tamar and, David with Bathsheba.
Yes.
There's a lot in the scripture that talks about sexual pornographic imagery.
Yes.
And yet the message is a message of redemption, the message of repentance. And so I think that's really the key thing in a movie is the message itself wholesome? I think, as you said, there can be more damage watching a movie that doesn't have any bad words or bad images, but has a message that's demonic, that's creating an ideology that's anti-gospel, anti-Christian. I think that's just as much of a danger. And pretty much most TV shows and most movies have elements of that.
Sure.
Like Disney right now is feeding it into all of their movies, just the kind of the woke ideology.
Yep. I think that's so if we link this to healing, Bob, I liked how you said, whatever we take in influences our hearts. And a primary way, in other words, how does the outside get inside us in a spiritual? Through our senses. Like, this is basic anthropology. This is Aquinas. But one of the ways that's subtle is our thoughts. And when we do healing work with people, there's healing of the body that, if people aren't aware of this, you can have traumatic stuff that's occurred that actually is held in your body, and it manifests, quote unquote, manifests more in your body than it would maybe in your thoughts. I could nuance that, but I'm just not going to for the sake of time. So your body is an access point to the soul, as well as ideas are an access point to the soul. And so both matter. And what's interesting is if a movie was made of the Bible, what would it be rated? That's an interesting spin, because based on what you're saying, there would be some sections that might merit an R-rated scene, depending on how vivid the director made it.
Yeah, Noah and his sons after the flood, right?
Right, Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, all the way through.
And how about this one? And boy, our friend Christopher West might have a field day with this one, but what about the Song of Songs?
Yeah.
That is a holy depiction of the one flesh union that's intended and meant to be an icon of the Trinity. How do you navigate all this? So I think the thing we're trying to nuance, and I hear us doing it delicately, is be careful in the extremes to, oh, this stuff doesn't bother me, or I'll never watch anything. Like, be careful. The virtue's usually not found in the extremes. It's usually found in the integration of what the two things are trying to avoid. And so the goal, though, is healing, restoration, and having the eyes to see. Here's my issue with watching those kinds of movies. It will get something in you that changes how you interact with people. So if you take like a sex scene and, you watch a TV show that's all it is sex scenes, like Sex in the City. Never watched it. The name sure has an interesting lead to it. But that's one thing that, okay, I might watch an inappropriate scene, but how does it affect the woman at the grocery store that I interact with? How does it affect the woman that I'm married to? How does it affect, do I tolerate people looking at my daughters in a particular way because I'm just used to it? That's the culture. Heck no, that's not okay. Anyway, any more thoughts there? We'll move on.
No, I think that's good. I think
we're good.
Covered the waterfront. I hope so, for the person who asked it and for everybody who's listening.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think that one bridges into another one, which I think is handy. I'll just read this one quote. I'll read this one verbatim. The Lord asked us to pray, lead me not into temptation. Often, we ask the Lord to help us in our struggles. On the other hand, the research I've done on intrusive thoughts says to not fight them and just let them be. I think they're referencing the mindfulness literature. Does the research on not fighting intrusive thoughts contradict praying for help in our struggles? Does praying draw attention to intrusive thoughts? Does asking for help from the Lord draw attention to unwanted thoughts and reinforce them? Fun question.
Yeah, it is a good question. There's a lot of pieces to that too.
A lot of pieces. Why don't you kick us off?
Okay. And again, the intrusive thoughts can be any kind. I've had people talk about them being thoughts of murder or suicide, or thoughts of sexual imagery, or thoughts of just broken relationships, or it can be any kind of things. And I realize there's different levels of intensity of intrusive thoughts too, as opposed to just a normal temptation versus something that's like an obsession.
That's a great distinction
for somebody. So we're talking about a continuum here.
Do you want to break that down quickly, or will that take you off your flow there?
We can do that. Yeah. And again, all these are categories within the demonic world, which is a temptation is something that just suggested to you that doesn't have a continual knocking at your door of your mind, so to speak, or your thoughts.
Yep.
It's just there and out, and sometimes it may come stronger.
Yep.
An obsession is something that we really lost a sense of freedom with, and it's just kind of persistent, and so it would be a much more intensive intrusive thought. That's a pattern of thought.
Yes.
Anything you add to that?
This is going to sound really weird, but it reminds me of birds.
Yeah.
You can have a bird chirping, or you can have a woodpecker breaking down and getting to the interior places, or you can have a bird that picks you up and takes you where you do not want to go.
I had a friend of mine that used to say, you can't stop a bird from flying overhead, but you can stop them from planting a nest in your hair.
That is that is, that sounds like a person with a glass of lemonade on a porch.
But they were talking about temptation.
There you go. There you go.
Versus agreement with it.
Yeah, making a home, letting it make a home within us. So I think people, that's a valuable distinction, because intrusive, that's what I heard you nuancing. Intrusive is different than, it just popped up, versus a temptation. So that nuancing is a valuable thing. And so if we zoom in on intrusive, where were you headed next?
Yeah, let's just take sexual imagery.
Okay.
Since that was part of that movie question, and we'll just flow right in here. Okay, let's say you have a sexual imagery come to your mind. Okay, or sexual desire, sexual thought. Mm-hmm. There are both approaches that can be very important and very effective. The first approach is suggested by Scripture, which is take every thought captive that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and just submit it. And so if I have sexual temptation, sexual thoughts, or any other kinds of temptations, as soon as I become aware of it, it becomes, Jesus, I just bring this to you. I just give this to you. And from there, if it's something that he wants me to explore where it's coming from, I'm doing it with the Holy Spirit. It's our friend who says the mind's a dangerous place.
Yeah, that's Chris Stefanik. The mind's a dangerous neighborhood. Don't go in alone.
Don't go in there alone. Yeah. And so I think the question is do we entertain thoughts alone? I wouldn't recommend that, because I think you can, particularly if it's demonic, it's more powerful than you are. I mean, your will is powerful, but it's going to pull you, particularly if you have access points there.
Yes.
In terms of wounds or past sins.
Yeah. Don't go pick a fight with a guy who's 10 times your size. Like just be careful.
That's not smart. But if you got your dad with you, you can entertain it. Not necessarily pick a fight, but you're protected.
Yep.
And so some sexual imagery, what we teach people is, not to be in fear of it, but pay attention to, we've talked about this on podcast on pornography before, pay attention to what it is, and you find out what the holy desire is, the unmet need, the unhealed wound. And so you pray into the reality behind that thought and see where it's coming from, see where it has attachment to you, and pray for healing of those places of attachment, and see if there's places where healthy desires are being suppressed and are coming out sideways in that imagery. What would you add?
You ended right where I was thinking, which was, I think it'd be problematic to just throw the thought out the window because it's attached to something, especially ones that are persistent. So if you're dealing with a woodpecker of sorts, if we use the bird analogy, that thing's not going away. It has found something it wants, and it's persistent. Like I remember growing up, we had one, and it literally destroyed a window frame. And there's probably some rich analogy or story in there, but the wildlife people said, sorry, you're not allowed to do anything. It's an extinct bird. And we're like, so we have to let it destroy our home? What are you talking about? So then so then they said, they're pretty easy to get rid of. Just get a ladder and go nail a fake snake right where it wants to go. It will never come back. And it worked. What a weird, anyway. So if we don't deal with what the thought is rooted in, like you said, the unholy desire, unmet need, etc., then the intrusive thought's probably not going to work. You're probably not going to get a lot of restoration, or you're not going to get a lot of restoration with regard to that. So the literature has an interesting dynamic to it. And if the question wasn't specific, but I'm going to assume it's talking about some of the mindfulness literature, which is don't go grabbing anything, just let everything free flow, in front of you. I would say all things have to be discerned, and there are elements of truth to that are, in my mind, very good. And what that is a surrendering, but you have to ask the next question: surrendering to whom or to what? If I'm just surrendering to nothing, I'm not a big fan of that. But if I'm surrendering to the Lord, and let's imagine that, I'm sitting in front of Jesus, and we're face to face, and between us is a creek, and my thoughts flow down the creek. The key is that he and I are looking at them together. And so I glance and go, oh, here comes one. I'm not only going to look at the thought coming down the creek, I'm going to glance up at him, and we're going to dialogue about it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get in the water, because it might be a crocodile that's there. Like, be careful, but don't do it alone. And so I'm just going to sit back and let everything flow. Be careful, because the enemy can and does put thoughts in your head.
Yeah.
That's a wild thing that I asked a lot of questions of people who know more about that area than me. Can the devil put a thought in your head? And I kind of chuckled, because the person responded, said, yes, it's called a temptation. I was like, right.
Yeah.
Pretty simple. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'd go back and listen to our episodes on discerning of spirits, and, particularly the first one.
Right. The evil spirit can put thoughts in your head. And the cool part about the definition of the evil spirit, which I've really appreciated, is it's not just a demonic dynamic. It could be an old wound that's being appropriately categorized under that umbrella. So I guess, should I address intrusive thoughts? Should I go after them? Should I pay attention to them? I think what I'm hearing us say is Christopher's phrase, go in with him.
Yep.
And so, yes, but not alone, because then you're managing it, working through it with truth himself, and you're activating all the relational dynamics that are necessary for healing. Like your phrase, which is so nice and so simple and so true. Love is what heals. Mm-hmm. So if you need healing from something, you need to be in a loving relationship, a loving setting, so that healing can occur.
Yeah, and in that whole process, you can be deceived. So it's just being aware of where the temptations are. Like, for example, if there's resentment to somebody, we went through this on the forgiveness exercise. Rather than suppress the anger that's behind the resentment, let's bring the anger out, but with the Holy Spirit. Let's bring it out and acknowledge what the anger is, and then let's go deeper underneath the anger to where the hurt is and the identity beliefs, rather than nursing the anger and fueling the resentment, which you can see the different directions there. One's the Holy Spirit's bringing healing, the other the enemy's bringing us into a greater trap.
Bob, it reminds me of the Anatomy of a Wound series. I mean, what's so funny, I don't know, I'd be curious, do you think about that concept a lot? Because I sure do. It's so in my bones. Yeah. I'm always thinking fruit to root. What's the deeper dynamic? You're the same?
Yeah.
And the other thing, just as a sidebar, I think I've said this 100 times in this podcast. It feels like I have. Whether or not I have, I don't know. I'm always surprised by how powerful vow work is. Mm-hmm. Because I go, vow, get back to the deeper stuff. And what's weird is that I don't often address the vow stuff, but when I do, I experience fruit. So let me ask you a spin-off question then. Why might that be the case for me? Why am I experiencing what feels like fruit because I'm addressing a vow, but if I skip that and just go to memory work, let's say, I don't seem to have as much fruit. Why might that be the case?
That's a good question, and I would have to explore more.
Well, let's explore if we want.
Well, let me use an analogy first, because as soon as you brought that up, a texting conversation today struck me, and then we'll come back to that.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. A woman who had a very troubled early childhood relationship with her mother, and the mother was possessive and also neglecting, and a lot of abandonment pain. made a vow, which she didn't know, that when she became a mother, she was going to be super mom and never miss her children's needs, not use them. I mean, there's all these, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do this, all these vows that were around that. And so she's been doing a lot of deep work on the pain of that, the confusion, the codependency, the abandonment pain underneath it. But what she's becoming aware of, and is what she texted today, and I hope she doesn't mind. She listens to the podcast, so this could be one of the questions we entertain anonymously on the podcast today.
Yeah.
But she said, why am I always feeling so heavy, taking so much responsibility, and feel like I'm always going to fail?
Wow.
And I heard vow.
Wow.
Right? What's the vow there? The vow is I'm never going to be like my mother. Right? And so I can relate to that. The vows that I took, I'm not going to be like my dad, related to marriage and infidelity, and the burden that they put on you, and the ways that we then overfunction, take over responsibility. Things become drudgery. They become weighty. We develop pride around those things. And so all of that, to free that up, frees our hearts up to do the other work, and which is where, it's like it invites the Holy Spirit in, where there's just been the spirit of control or the spirit of pride.
How did you know to go right to vow? Because I followed you, but I'm trying to think on behalf of the listener. That's probably not a knee-jerk reaction in a good way for them. How did you heard that and went, vow? Can you break that down so our listeners could maybe do the same?
Yeah, part of that's just sensitivity to it over time. But I in terms of breaking it down, whenever, Jesus talks about my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The Pharisees put heavy burdens and heavy yokes on people, the heavy yoke of the law.
Yes.
And so I've become aware in my own heart when something feels burdensome and heavy rather than light and an easy yoke, it's probably because of a vow.
Wow.
And so because of doing that work in my own heart and becoming aware of that, and there's still areas where I'm not aware, but just that sensitivity, I'm now become much more sensitive with other people. When things become burdensome, when they become heavy, when there's a sense of responsibility with it, it's almost always a vow, like an over sense of responsibility. It's almost always a vow that's pushing that.
I am really blessed by that. One of my favorite scriptures is Matthew 11.
Yeah.
That's the yoke is easy.
Yoke is easy.
And if there's like this historical biblical dynamic about yokes. The yokes are referenced throughout the Old Testament all the time, and that God is who breaks their yokes.
Uh-huh.
And so there's an interesting dynamic there. I can't weave it all together in my head right now, but that just feels, I've never put vow, ungodly yoke together.
Yeah.
And the feeling is heavy.
We may have explained this before, but a yoke in biblical times and still today is the apparatus they put around the cattle's neck.
Yep.
Right? So that they would plow together.
Yep.
And so the yoke then became a term for oppression, right, in the Old Testament. And then the Pharisees used the law in a way that was oppressive. So Jesus talks about that as a yoke. And in a certain sense, that's Pelagianism, right?
Plow my own field, figured out.
Plow my own field, doing everything on my own.
Yeah.
Rather than being yoked to Jesus, which is a light yoke, which is, what we're talking about in all of these conversations. And so whenever it feels heavy and burdensome, we're probably in a ungodly self-reliance, which is what the vows are. The vows are ways in which, based on our woundedness, we've taken on that ungodly self-reliance, and it builds pride. I used to have this pride that I'm not acting like my dad in this particular area where he was acting out, or my brother in that particular area, or anybody else. And that pride then creates a heavy yoke.
Wow.
On me and the people around you.
Yeah.
Which is the Pharisee and the tax collector in the biblical story.
It crushes you in both ways, whether it be I can't do it or look how good I am, I'm doing it. And then
Yep.
I'm crushed by pride, and I'm crushing the people around me because I'm putting
Yep.
the same yoke on them.
I'm putting it on them. Yeah. So it's really important, these vows. We so blind to them because they feel like just natural life.
They feel normal. Yeah. They feel, and I think that's, back to the point that I brought up earlier. They're so normal. That to me is something that why I probably move past them, because it feels appropriate. It feels normal because it's the way that I've learned how to do life and make life work on my terms. So why would I question that? And it's not even like I'm doing something wrong. You could potentially hear the vow right there in me. But if it feels normal, you don't question it.
Yep. I think it's where we are spiritually blind. That's why we don't see them.
And thus the value of healthy, good community, regular prayer, because, and here's where it gets fun. Where are the places that your vows are typically pointed out in your closest relationships?
Yep.
Probably marriage.
Yep.
And that's where you probably get most frustrated.
Yep.
Because it's like somebody saying, why are you walking backwards? And you're like, no, I'm not walking backwards. Like, you're so critical. What is wrong? You're always,
Yeah.
And they're like, no, you're walking backwards. There's a way better way to walk. You can go faster. It doesn't hurt as much.
Yeah.
It's just, there's a lot there. That's really cool. Yeah. Any more we'd say there?
Yeah. Did we get back to your question, which is why do you feel so much fruit when you do with vows?
Here's the thought. If I tried to answer my own question, here would be what comes up. When I'm working on vows, I'm allowing myself, I'm relieving the yoke.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that I don't have the temptation to go put the yoke back on, because now I have to go deal with the original thing that I'm reacting to that birthed the vow. But I think a lot of times for me, life can be heavy.
Yeah.
And because it's interesting, I was having a conversation the other day with Heather, and one of the words that I used to describe a general sense that I feel like, what's a word that describes how you feel most of the time? And the word was pressure. And I went, man. And so it makes sense based on what you're saying about yokes. No wonder.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're out in the weeds here, but maybe it's fruitful for people. I'm sorry, listeners. I'm getting my own Bob time here. You can just listen along or go to the next episode. But I'm asking these questions for myself as well as maybe for other people, because the answer doesn't come quick with this one. Is it possible to heal a wound and not address the vow? In my mind, it's no. You can't fully be restored in that domain if you don't address the entire anatomy of the wound, which includes the vow.
Well, I would say sometimes when the wound is healed and the identity belief and the judgments, that the vow just poof. It's like you don't need it anymore.
That makes sense. If I'm not afraid of ... then I don't feel the pressure to. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah. The two, you talk about the freedom that you experience when you deal with the vows. The fruit is the freedom. It's like all of a sudden it goes from oppression to lightness.
Yes.
But people can also experience fear when they release a vow.
Interesting.
That's often an experience, is the fear related to the reason why the vow was made in the first place. So the vow is an area of control. When we take away the control, we've got fear, and the fear is pointing to the wound. And so it can work both ways. It can work from vow down to the wound, or it can work from the wound and releasing the vow from the area of the wound.
You can go, and that's the fun part about the anatomy is, you can go to the infection and then come out, or start with the infection and go into the original source of the wound. Yeah. Okay. I feel like that's good. Well, let's move on. Let's do a couple quick hitters here.
Okay.
The one I looked at, I'm like, oh, that's not a quick hitter. We'll have to touch base about that, but we'll have to, I'll just go ahead and say it, but I'm going to challenge.
It'll be an episode series.
Yeah. It'll be an episode series, and that's on transgenderism.
Yeah.
You and I have talked about, so we've gotten a few questions about transgenderism and, healing about that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you sent me a link to a friend of ours, Jason Everett, who was on Matt Fradd's podcast. And Heather and I ended up talking about the episode. And I was blown away by Jason Everett and what he's doing. So we'll add a link to that in these show notes, because we're not ready yet to do a series on that. We'd for sure have Jason on in doing that. It's just part of our workflow. It's on the list of things we want to get to. But in the meantime, please go listen to that episode. The thing that struck me the most about that, and then maybe you can comment and then we'll move on. The transgender issue is something that's out there, and it just requires a really good response. And that's not easy to do. You have to do a lot of homework, and you need to have a pastoral heart. Having both of those is tough. Jason Everett has both.
Yep. That was what really touched me on that.
I was so impressed with him, and I want people to get what he's given. So any thoughts you would have there?
Yeah. What I loved is he really researched it, not just at the psychological and spiritual level and the cultural level, but the biological level and the anthropological. He really researched. Yeah. He did his homework. And so his answers are not the kind of black and white answers that we typically have when we're fighting the cultural war.
Yep.
Which those are also important, but they aren't helpful for individual people.
Yep.
When people were struggling in different areas.
Yeah.
And so I thought just his research and his nuancing of the depths of influences that can influence the struggle, and yet also validating a lot of what we know psychologically from his research, that of how identity gets affected at really early ages and how that then plays itself out, and then how the culture now comes in and takes it and really turns it into a much worse issue than what most people would grow through naturally between 13 and 21 as they're dealing with their sexuality. And now as a culture, we've so reified the reality that we've created a level of abuse that's so damaging. And I think when we get to the series, we're going to have some guests that have already identified themselves who've gone through the process and talk about some of the damage that's happened.
Yeah, that it's just a big deal. There's a little bit of hope. There's hope, but one of the areas that I have hope is there's people on the other side of the political spheres who would consider themselves atheist or whatever, who also see the issue with the cultural narrative here.
Yeah.
And I'm really grateful for that, because it sounds like those people are trying to be good thinkers.
Yeah. Well, even, I think Jason mentioned even some of the cultures like Denmark, Sweden, wherever, that are most typically liberal, are now recognizing how much damage has been done, and they're coming back and they're refusing to offer those. In England, that's also happening. Yeah. And John Hopkins, which started it, refuses to do it. I mean, it's not good science. It's not good psychology. It's not good medicine. It's not good anything. Yeah. The way that the culture is doing it. And we have the President of the United States and everybody else championing it. And it's just like, how mad can we get in terms of insane as a culture? Just how insane can we get?
Oh, yeah. We'll have to come back to that one. So listeners, but between now and then, or just it doesn't go, we want you to go listen to, it's on Matt Fradd's podcast, his guest, Jason Everett. So it's on YouTube. We'll have a link to it in the show notes. Another quick hitter. Simple question. Where can I find a good spiritual director? So quick story. I don't know if I shared it before, but quick story. I didn't have a consistent spiritual director for about, I think it's like 13 years. And it wasn't for lack of trying. It was such a weird dynamic. I kept seeking, door shut, door shut. I'm asking, like, going up to the person who's, selling me my shoes and be like, are you a spiritual? I'll take anybody. I don't care anymore. And the Lord is probably like, oh, hold on, Jake. But we had the privilege of, what's interesting is both your spiritual director and my spiritual director have been on the podcast, but Father Boniface, my spiritual director, does spiritual direction training. And so we put this out to him, and he had an answer to the question, which was, go look at this trustworthy Catholic spiritual director website, which is seekdirection.app, A-P-P. I have never heard of that before until he mentioned it. Did you know about that?
No, I didn't know about that. And we get that question all the time. Just had it last week in our conference.
Yeah.
And didn't know the answer.
So Father Boniface is recommending that people go to seekdirection.app. What I've found as a quick tip or trick, usually it feels like this is the case with spiritual directors and therapists. The good ones don't have space. That's the vibe I've gotten. But here's the trick. I've learned this as a therapist. I don't do spiritual direction. Ask the good spiritual director who they would go to if they had to find one. Ask them, where would you go to find a good therapist? Who would you go see? And now your list starts populating again, you know?
Yeah. And they're probably full too, but but what we're highlighting, and it's exciting to see. I mean, it's so much in our heart to form and help generate more available Christian Catholic therapists. And also, there's lots of schools now that are forming spiritual directors. And so there is a lack of what we need in terms of an adequate number. And yet there is a lot. And so there's people that we don't know about that are good spiritual directors and good therapists.
Yeah.
But it's really difficult oftentimes when we get that question of being able to recommend somebody because the ones we know are full, or we just don't know the particular work at enough level.
Would you recommend, does the spiritual director have to be a priest?
No, it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, I would agree. They don't have
I would
to
say
be
for a priest, it should be a priest.
Agreed.
But even not all priests I know have a priest spiritual director.
Yeah.
Seminarians, it has to be, right?
Yeah, and their formation has to be. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that people get stuck on that one. So that's why I bring it up, because it doesn't have to be a priest. And there are some settings where if you're a layman, having a layman as your spiritual director is a huge benefit.
Yeah.
There are things about married life that a priest just doesn't know that influence your relationship with God. Now, here's a quick distinction. I think everybody needs to know it, and it's this. The spiritual direction relationship is about your relationship with God. A lot of people seek spiritual direction, and they're actually looking for a therapist. And they call it spiritual direction because they want a God-centered psychotherapist. Here's how you distinguish. If you have questions and desires to grow in your relationship with God and God alone, you're talking spiritual direction and some healing. If you're talking about other stuff, you're probably talking therapy. It's nice to have that distinction so you don't go and start and then you're like, why is this not working or not going anywhere? So, Bob, any final thoughts? Let's land the plane here. Any final things you'd want to mention based on the questions that we had, or anything you want to say to the listeners before we close?
No, just this is fun. I love we do our podcast that way anyhow. We don't know where we're going, and we just kind of let the Spirit lead, and hopefully it's the Spirit leading.
We hope.
And this was fun, and we'll do another one. So encourage everybody to send in some questions. When we get enough accumulated questions, we'll do another one.
Yep. RestoreTheGloryPodcast.com is the best place to do it. Just submit on the form submission there. You can send one. And we have people who will try to curate those for us and send them to us. We'll try to get it and address them. So listeners, we're grateful for you. We ask that you'd pray for all that's going on. Our podcast is blessing a lot of people, and we'd love it to bless more people. So if you've been blessed by a particular episode, please share it with somebody. It is one of the simplest things to do, is to just go, hey, check out this episode. I do that all the time with various things. So we'd encourage you to do that, not because we're looking for more people to listen, but because we do it because we want people to know the Lord and to experience healing. So that's why we're doing it. So listeners, thanks so much. We'll talk to you again soon. God bless.